Hey, this is the Just Us podcast. I'm Aidan, your host. Today we have on special guest Tomm Carlson. Plus, we are also having on special substitute co-host Aidan Knudsen. Today we went cross-platform to record this for you guys. He was all the way across the country, but hope you guys enjoy. There were a few difficulties, but today our topic today was we are actually going through and naming the top three best generations. So I hope you guys enjoy and tell me what you think by following.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson, for coming on the very first episode of the Just Us podcast.
My favorite generation, actually, my third favorite generation, sorry. I'm going to put up the most recent one, Generation Alpha, I'm going to have to say. They're going to have to be the richest generation to be, and also the smartest education to be, unless their education crashes. Just because most Generation Alpha is not going to be going to college, and since they have the online ability to learn, they're going to be very smart with that. They're going to have unlimited learning, and they're also going to be the new digital generation, where Gen Z will be following up with that. And sorry.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah.
Tomm, what are your thoughts on that?
So number 3 for AJ is Gen Alpha. They're going to be the smartest. I could see that. I went to college as a millennial. I learned some things, but I definitely agree that I think I learned more after college when I was just interested in figuring out what I wanted to learn and going to finding the resources on YouTube or whatever. And I got a couple Gen Alphas in my house because I'm a father, and they definitely act that way, AJ. They find something they want, they look it up, they watch a bunch of videos on it, and all of a sudden they know way more than I do.
Yeah, that's good to know. I have never actually, how do you say it? Never actually done live testing on a human being, so I wouldn't really know that much. Anyways,
Tomm's coming with experience.
Yeah, but another thing I thought was interesting is, let's see if you go up, Generation Alpha. There is currently 48 million Generation Alphas, or Gen A's, I guess you could say, in the U.S. currently.
Okay.
And they were started being born 2012 and will continue at least through 2025, which I think is interesting because so many different platforms say so many different things. Here I was 12 years old thinking I'm Generation Alpha, but turns out that another site thinks that it's 2012 through 2025, and yeah, so that's interesting for me. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a ton of them. There's probably going to be more. And, man, it's crazy. The more they grow up, the more stuff they're going to get into. And we're going to see what their interests end up being. So, yeah, it makes sense that it's number 3 for you.
Yeah. And my little siblings being Gen A, they're very smart with lots of online things. My little brother, he's quite the gamer. He plays Fortnite, and he's really good. So I can see them being very good at digital games and digital workings, and yeah.
Now, AJ, you're Gen Z, and you said your siblings are Gen A. What things do they like that are different from what you like or are into?
Well, they definitely don't play with their toys as much as I did. When I was little, I would play with, I had at least 100 toys, and I would just go in my room and trash my room with a bunch of dolls and whatnot, Batman and Scooby-Doo. And so I remember growing up on toys, and they're kind of growing up on video games, which I did not as much until I became around 8 or 9, was when I started actually playing video games a little bit more. But even now, I don't play like as much as they do. So
Sure.
yeah,
Totally.
But so if you want, we can let you or Aidan go next for top 3 generations, or is Aidan still thinking about it?
I'd say I'd let the guest go first.
All right, Mr. Carlson, you can go ahead.
Okay, so you want my number 3?
Yep.
My number 3 would probably be Gen X, which I think they were born in like the 60s and the 70s. So that would be like my parents, maybe your parents too.
Yeah, my parents are Generation X.
Yep. And the reason is just because, they have a style, I think, that is just not necessarily my favorite, but they grew up in more like grungy in like the 80s, I think, when it was kind of grungy and everyone was kind of messing around doing 80s stuff, right? If you ever saw Stranger Things, that kind of stuff. So I mean, it was cool, but like I think it's a good number 3 for me. I don't necessarily, it's not my favorite, but it's not horrible. So that's kind of where I'm at. Some Gen Xers I know were really into skateboarding and hacky sack, which is cool, but I'd maybe rather do other things.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I definitely think the 80s, like growing up in the 80s, having people born in like the 60s and 70s, like they kind of have this unique style that differentiate themselves from everyone else. It's definitely a very interesting topic when it comes to understanding how their culture came about, and especially it definitely matters what generation they were born from, and that definitely affects the whole generation growing up.
Yes.
And
So AJ, you mentioned a minute ago about technology and how Gen A uses it. In your Gen Z,
Yep.
how do you think? What things do you think Gen A is more interested in than you are as a kid or something? Like, what differences do you see?
Well, do you mean like what do I do with technology that like Generation Alpha doesn't?
Yeah, with technology or just growing up. I mean, you guys are technically part of 2 different generations. Like, so I think, like I just mentioned, Gen X was my 3rd favorite. They didn't grow up with the technology I did, and certainly that you didn't. And they had, I think, some early video games and certainly television, but they didn't have computers and they didn't have apps or even phones you could do anything on.
Right.
So they did a lot more playing outside. They did a lot more. Probably board games. They did a lot more inside stuff. Do you see the Gen A people in your house? You said your younger siblings. Do you see them doing anything different than you did when you were a kid?
Right. Well, I see them diving into video games much more than I did. Like, I would spend most of my days during summer riding my bike, water gun fights, balloon fights, playing with like toys and action figures in my room. Sometimes I'd be on my tablet, my Kindle a little bit, but I just don't see them playing with their toys as much. So that's interesting to me how like just like 5 years later the kids are being born, like all they do is really but how they find entertainment is really just through television, and there's nothing wrong with it in my opinion, because a lot of the shows they watch are very educational. I think that's good. And I watch them too. So, but they're watching a show right now about veterinarians, and I like it a lot too. So they seem to like that, but they also play video games, and yeah. So I didn't play video games as much, but So I guess they're a little bit more into the technology end.
Totally.
I'm sounding like an older, but really, I didn't really have that much. Like, we did get a PS4 and we had a Wii, but like again, school went first for most of the time, and so and I'm playing with toys and Legos.
Well, as a millennial, we played a lot of video games, and we didn't even have the online gaming that your generation has, but we just But then that was the fun part when I was a kid. Like, we went to each other's houses. We had people coming over because you had to come over if you wanted to play together with people. And that was super fun because, like, one guy would have, like, the new system or whatever, and we'd all flood over to his house and play all night, which was awesome.
Yeah, that's definitely... I think those type of things are fun, but then, we don't have an excuse to go to our friend's house. So
Right.
that would have been fun to be a millennial.
Mhm.
But, so that was your third favorite, Gen X, right? And
Totally, yep.
Yep, so Gen X, that's good. It's a good reason. But I'm going to have to kind of attack you on that in a little bit.
Okay.
So, Aidan, go ahead. For your
All
third
right.
favorite.
Let me see. My third favorite. No offense, Tom, but I'm gonna have to say millennials.
Oh, I knew it.
I have a perception, and maybe this could be incorrect, but it seems to me that the millennials, they were kind of at more of a disadvantage than, let's say, like Generation X or Gen Z. They were kind of caught in this little weird in-between because they weren't born in the 70s and they didn't grow up where when they became adults they were introduced to all this technology and were able to use it in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
They were born into it, and so due to them being kind of born into the more technological age, they were born in, what was it, like the 80s and 90s. And so they were definitely born when all the computers were coming out, and in the early 2000s when all the phones were released, they were in their teens. So they will have definitely been introduced and had more of a jump, though the Gen Z has the more advanced technology, and they've definitely got a better grip on it because it's definitely more user-friendly, and the experiences with the technology now is better. Though I will say the millennials seemingly have better education with regards to degrees, and I believe they have a higher completion of high school diplomas. However, with like how you guys were saying earlier, it's definitely a different learning experience now than it had been. So it's definitely a tough call, but I believe millennials would have to go into a third place for me. That's good.
Yeah, Aidan, I'm going to have to back that up and also say, when you were saying that they are in a weird place, they do seem to be split up in a way, because there's a Gen Y, or Generation like Millennial, 0.1, and Generation Millennial 0.2, which splits up the different ages of millennials. So that's kind of weird, and no other generation has that. So I'm going to have to say that is weird. And alright, so the ages I'm saying for baby boomers. So their current age is 57 to 75. Their birth year is 1946 to 1964. Then Generation X, my parents, 1965 to 1978 or 1980.
Okay.
The current age is 41 to 56. Their size is 65.2 million, which is one of the lowest. But, anyways, millennials is 1980 to 1994 to 1996. Their current age is 25 to 40. And Gen Z is 1997 to 2012. Their current age, 9 to 24. Then there's Generation Alpha, 2012 to 2025, hopefully 0 to 9, 48 million, and growing.
Okay,
So, yeah.
makes sense. And then the millennials, you're seeing, what's the 1.1 and 1.2?
Some of them are still in
Or
early
Y.2.
adulthood, wrestling with new careers and settling down. With the older millennials having a home and are building a family, you can imagine now having a child might change your interests and priorities. So for marketing purposes, it's useful to split this generation into Gen 1 and Gen 2.
Yeah, I can see that.
Gen Y1, Gen Y2.
That split might happen. That split might happen for Gen Z later when they're in that transition spot. It sounds like the millennials just fall in there right now.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like this happens to most of the generations, though not as widely captured for like the greatest generation and the boomers. Though for sure they would fall under that category in some ways. Seemingly the millennials fall under that the best. But you know, Gen Z, they've got the 2 targeting centers right now because they are on that older end of adulthood, younger end of adulthood, older teen years. So they've got some marketing campaigns trying to capture both, and trying to make sure that they're able to stay in touch and understand how they work. But I could see how they're going to start splitting generations into kind of 2 categories and have them more splits.
Yeah, for my second, I'm going to have to say the greatest generation.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to have to pull that up. Greatest generation. The years are 1910 to 1924. Youngest age today is 99.
Wow.
The oldest age today is 113.
Wow.
My great-great-grandma is actually one of the youngest greatest generation.
I think she would fall under the silent generation. She would be one of the oldest members of the silent generation.
Well, I guess she's silent generation. That's interesting. I've never heard of the silent generation.
I guess that's why they call it the silent generation.
Oh.
Yeah. Generation of introverts, I guess.
Well, I think they call it that because the greatest generation, of course, went to war. They were born and grew up and went to World War II. The silent generation were coming of age during the war in the 30s and the 40s, and so their childhood was poor. Their childhood was filled with war. Their dad was gone. Their brothers were gone, and they kind of got stilted. You can't really build a life and have too many crazy interests and take risks when all that's going on, you know?
Yeah.
And all the policies in government were being set in place, and there was definitely economic issues with housing and definitely with food. And so they had a lot of battles on their own growing up. Though I think that made them a little bit more versatile than other generations.
Absolutely.
Made them a little bit tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's a noble choice, AJ, because my second is probably the baby boomers, so yours is a little more noble, the fighters, the war fighters. My second is the baby boomers who came after the war when all the soldiers came home. And it's probably my second favorite just because that's my parents. I think after you read that through that, my parents fit into that category. And, you know, they're hard workers, and they saved money, I think. Their parents were very frugal from the greatest generation, like you said, or the silent generation maybe. And so they definitely fit the mold and taught us millennials a lot, so that falls into the second favorite for me.
Yeah. I would say, when you say it, that they did save money. Yeah. Baby boomers have an average of $1 million. That's their average. So, and I'm going to have to be like, yeah, that makes sense. Because really, you don't see many boomers like in Kansas or, anywhere up north. But they're all down here in Florida. So,
sure.
And here is a very expensive place to live. So I have to say you're right about that. Then
I think you'd find baby boomers anywhere in the world, It's a whole generation, though we do see many snowbirds in the South.
Yeah.
I think that they kind of just tend to live in these communities during the winter due to them kind of older folks tend to get a little bit more cold, so they go to the warmer climate and they stay there for the bit while it's cold, and then go back to their hometown where they grew up. They definitely kind of stay planted where they were raised in those cities, and they vacation when it gets cold, especially from the north. However, if they were born and raised in Florida, they kind of tend to stay there, and same goes with the West Coast and the Midwest.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And so that was our second. Then, Aidan, would you like to say your second favorite then?
Let me think about this for a second. I'm inclined to say, I think I'm gonna have to agree with you. I think that would be my second, is the baby boomer. Though there's definitely a mentality and a negativity towards baby boomers, they definitely helped the educational system, especially for the millennials and for Gen X. They tried to help participate in raising the education level, and they were smart with their money, and they knew how to save, and now they're set, and they're able to help raise children. And I think Gen X and the millennials turned out fine so far that we can see. No problems. But yeah, I think there was just kind of a stable generation. They kind of just went with the flow, and if there were turns tossed their way, they would just kind of learn how to overcome them.
Yeah, that's a great answer for both of you, actually. I wasn't thinking that anyone would have boomers, but hearing that, I kind of feel like that Generation Alpha should have been second, maybe, and baby boomers third. But we're gonna have to move on because you can't go back in time
to the big number one. The big number one reveals.
Yep. All right, now I think so. That was a good answer, Aidan. Like I said before, but I'm gonna have to attack Tomm from earlier.
Okay.
About this, we're gonna have to go to war on this. Okay. My favorite is Generation X. Now I know you're thinking, well, they're kind of like punky when they're teenagers, and they didn't really listen to their parents much. But again, their parents were usually at work. They went to school. They biked home. The key under the mat. Like my mom grew up with this too. She would tell me, and her mom was usually at work, and I'm gonna have to say also, the movies and the shows and the actors coming from that generation, absolutely insane how well they did in the performance and entertainment era, and all the music was amazing. Also, that was when the music really went up. Like when you're thinking about it, the music that you're listening to in the car, the 80s and the 90s and the 70s, that is really just like some really amazing music from Gen X, and how creative that they were. So
that's true.
I'm gonna have to say that they are my favorite. But also, like, think about Rocky and like Star Wars. Well, Star Wars wasn't much Generation X, but
that came out when they were born.
They grew up with Star Wars.
They grew up with it. That was coming from the baby boomers.
But also, they had their Saturday morning Flintstones and Pink Panther. So I'm gonna have to say that they are a classic generation, and they're gonna be on my top favorite. You're welcome, Mom.
That's a good. That's a good answer. That's a good answer.
Yeah.
I for my number one. This is a little self-serving, but I am choosing the millennials for number one. Not just because I am a millennial, but there's real reasons. Okay, so the millennials, they didn't have to deal with the wars of the world, right? The boomers had to deal with Vietnam, and before that World War II and stuff, and You know, the millennials, we grew up in the 90s, and it was a pretty good time. It was a pretty good time, and we didn't have the fear of war and stuff. Now, 9/11 happened when I was like 13, so that was pretty horrible, obviously. But, you know, it was just a good childhood, and so, like you were saying, though, AJ, I like the millennials, I think, because of all the things that it produced, right? So, not that they produce, but... So it's a little different than you. I'm not saying what they produced, but I am saying what they got to experience was some of the best stuff, because I think it is a lot of that 90s stuff that is becoming cool again. You know, for a long time, no one cared about the 90s. It was old. It was whatever. But now it's sort of becoming cool again, you know, the styles and the shows, and every reboot on Netflix and other places are all like 90s reboots, which is awesome. And they're aiming toward people like me. But yeah, think about like Saturday morning cartoons were really for the millennials. Like that's when they really happened. We had all the great serials. We had all the great Saturday morning cartoons. We had, you know, tons of new video game systems. One of the toys I brought is my original N64 controller. For your listeners who can't see this, I have a gray Nintendo 64 controller that defined my childhood. It was so amazing, and I don't think any other generation can experience what we experienced when this thing came out. It was revolutionary. I have a few other props here, but I'll wait till the end to show you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, that's a great answer, millennials. I can see. I know you're not trying to be biased, but yeah, I can say I was not biased at all.
Clearly.
Yeah, because I'm Gen Z is not in my top 3. I think they're doing poorly, in my opinion. But yeah. So, yeah, we're going to have to move on to, I guess, Aidan's number 1. What do you have in pick for yourself? I'm feeling Generation X.
It's an interesting choice, but I think I will go... man, this is a tough one. Probably Generation X.
Okay.
Let's go.
I think they are more of a silent generation as compared to most. They're kind of more in the background and more quiet, definitely, than compared to the others. They grew up in a different time when they were just kind of allowed to go wherever they pleased, and that definitely brought about a different mentality than like the Gen Z or Gen Alpha, where they're kind of just more stuck inside and they're consumed with devices, and that's kind of their whole world is the meta. And I think Gen X, though they're able to plug into that world, it's not their main world. They grew up with the outdoors. They grew up with the shows that were kind of producing and encouraging, kind of being exploratory, right? They wanted them to go outdoors. They had all the boxing and got them into athletics, and they definitely grew up in that time when their parents would go work and they were kind of the workhorses, right,
Sure,
of the economy. And now definitely for Generation X, they're kind of more plugging along, trying to find their way, and they're definitely more of a hardworking, silent generation.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Totally. So we all had different ones.
Yeah, I'd have to say, yeah. But you both did have baby boomers for your second, so...
Okay. Although,
right?
you guys both had Gen X actually for your number 1, didn't you?
Well, yeah, but for your second...
We had number 1 for Gen X.
Okay.
And then I do believe we agreed
on Boomer.
The baby boomers, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
All right. So, you said you had another toy.
Oh, yeah, so here are some millennial relics from the 90s here. So I have for your listeners, I have my N64 controller. Let me get some audio here. Oh, yeah, everybody knows that audio. That's going to show up great. We have the one, this is a lasting thing that defined my generation that still is around today. People still like it. Gen Z likes it. Even Gen Alpha likes it. It is the beloved Pokemon cards. Which millennials starts? These are the old ones, guys. These are the old ones that I have. I have in my hand favorite Pokemon such as Pikachu, Jigglypuff. Right, this is before it exploded into 5 million different Pokemon. This was back when there was only 150. That's the real millennial way.
Yeah.
I have my another toy here. This is my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Sort of a Gen X like to this, but also those early millennials in the early 90s loved the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then finally, for every millennial boy in the 90s, the beloved TV show. I have in my hand a wallet of Power Rangers. This is something that has not stuck around, but boy was it big. It was huge.
Yeah.
And it taught us how to fight for what's right,
Yeah. I those are definitely some cool things you brought along. I think they're kind of more popular. They were more popular when you were growing up, but I think they've kind of stuck around, some of them.
Some of
They're
them.
definitely popular shows, and they're still beloved by the younger generations.
Absolutely.
Kind of more iconic. They fall under that iconic TV show categories, and the gaming system that kind of inspired some of the other consoles.
Yep.
Yeah, those are definitely cool things you brought along.
Absolutely. Well, good. We figured that out.
Yeah, well...
Host?
I'll have to-
Host, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I was just looking at some of the information on screen.
Uh-huh.
But, yeah, so that's interesting. I'll have to say the type of things that, I grew up on a lot of actual, like Gen X as a Gen Zer. I kind of grew up on, the Gen X television that my mom would turn on. So Scooby-Doo is obviously my favorite show. Like I mentioned before, Flintstones, the Jetsons, all those great shows. Barney, too, a little bit. So, yeah. But I'm going to have to say, that was a great top 3 list. We're going to have to close a little bit now. Thank you for attending the episode, Mr. Carlson.
Absolutely.
And
It was great
Aidan.
to be here.
Every generation, has its positives and negatives. There's definitely different mentalities growing up with each other's cultures, and they create interesting relationships with one another. And I think as each generation grows older, they grow wiser, and so they kind of understand and appreciate the prior generations. And definitely their young kids and their grandchildren, and each generation just kind of moves along, and they interact with one another in such unique ways.
Just that when we're all 20 years older, we can have this conversation again, and it might be very different. As all the generations, move along, and the Gen Zs are having families and houses, and the Alphas are coming up, and then there'll be one after that. Who knows what that'll be called? Beta, maybe?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you,
Pleasure having
guys.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening to the Just Us podcast. I'm AJ Knudsen, your host, and that is where we closed.